They say the West was built on dust, bullets, and broken promises. But sometimes, it was a single act of kindness that changed everything. That night, the wind howled across the prairie like a warning. The cowboy had just returned from driving cattle for 6 straight days, his boots soaked, his hands cracked, and his soul worn thin. He wasn't expecting a visitor, much menos a girl with Apache braids standing barefoot by his barn door, clutching a torn blanket and asking for shelter. What he didn't know was that offering her a dry place to sleep would alter the course of his life and ignite a firestorm between two worlds. In towns like Dead Man's Creek, folks talk more with their eyes than with their mouths, and rumors traveled faster than any telegram. By sunrise, word had already reached the hills. The tribe had heard, and to them, a man who gives a woman shelter gives her his name. By the time the cowboy stepped outside to feed his horses, 3 warriors were already watching him from the ridge, their faces solemn, unreadable. But they weren't there for a fight. They were there to welcome a new member of the family. What started as a simple act of mercy, a roof, some hay, a warm night without fear, was now something sacred. In Apache tradition, it meant bond, responsibility, honor. The cowboy, raised among rough ranch hands and hard whiskey, suddenly found himself wrapped in a code older and deeper than any Western law. And the girl? She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stood beside him, calm as dawn, her eyes saying what no words could. You protected me. Now you belong to something greater. But the townsfolk didn't understand. Whispers turned into shouts. He's been claimed, some mocked. He's cursed, others warned. Yet the cowboy didn't flinch. He remembered her trembling hands when she walked in. He remembered the cut on her foot and the way she flinched at thunder. He remembered choosing kindness when it was easier to close the door. And in that memory, he found a courage he never knew he had. This is not a tale of love at first sight. It's a tale of responsibility, of honor, and of a forgotten promise beneath the stars of the Old West. Because in those wild, untamed lands, where man's word meant more than any law, one night of kindness could bind 2 souls forever, and echo through generations like a song carried by the wind. The cowboy, named Elias, had always been a man of few words. He'd seen the desert swallow towns whole, watched cattle rustlers hang by noon, and buried friends before they turned 30. Life in the West taught you to keep moving, keep working, and keep your heart tucked behind your ribs like a hidden revolver. But that morning, as he watched the young Apache girl boil water over his small fire, something shifted inside him. She didn't look at him with gratitude, nor fear, just a quiet awareness, like she understood more about him than he did himself. Her name was Nita. She spoke little, but her silence wasn't empty. It was thick with meaning. She moved through the barn like she belonged there, like her soul had already claimed the ground. Elias watched as she fed his horse, ran her fingers along its mane, and hummed a song he'd never heard before. It wasn't a tune you'd hear in saloons or among the cowboys. It was older, rooted in the land, and whispered by women who had seen centuries pass without writing a single word. And in that moment, Elias knew this wasn't just a stranger sleeping in his barn. This was someone whose presence rewrote the rules of everything he thought he knew. By midday, the air was thick with tension. 3 members of Nita's tribe rode in, slow and steady. They didn't draw weapons, but they didn't need to. Their arrival alone was a message. The girl you sheltered is not just anyone. They dismounted with a grace foreign to the townsfolk, a fluid strength that came not from dominance, but from ancient pride. One of them, an older man with hawk-like eyes, stepped forward. He didn't ask. He declared, "You are her protector now. You are bound." Elias, confused but calm, nodded once. Something told him resistance would dishonor both her and himself. News of the encounter spread faster than wildfire. In Dead Man's Creek, the saloon filled with speculation. He married her. They tricked him. That's not law. Hell, it ain't even Christian. But behind those voices was fear, not of Elias, not of the tribe, but of a bond formed outside their control, one that didn't ask permission from white man's rulebooks. Elias didn't answer to their judgments. He'd lived long enough to know that real honor didn't need a courtroom or a preacher. It only needed one truth. A man keeps his word, even when that word is born in silence. That night, Nita stayed inside the cabin. She sat near the fire, her hands weaving something he couldn't yet recognize. Elias sat across from her, the crackle of wood the only sound between them. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, what the tribe expected, what the town would try, or what he was now becoming. But in the flicker of that firelight, with her presence calm and unshaken, he felt something rare on the frontier. Peace. Not comfort, not certainty, but a quiet, sacred stillness, like standing on the edge of a canyon and knowing it'll still be there tomorrow, no matter how loud the wind blows. The following day brought no reprieve from the stairs. Elias walked into town to buy flour and salt, and every pair of eyes followed him like a rifle barrel, tracking a target. Men he used to ride with tipped their hats with hesitation. Women whispered behind gloved hands, and the sheriff, an old drinking companion, offered a nod so stiff it felt like a warning. Still, Elias didn't flinch. The West had taught him how to survive ambushes, gunfights, and blizzards. He figured he could survive ignorance too. Back at the barn, Nita had hung small bundles of herbs above the doorway. Their scent filled the air, rich and unfamiliar. Elias didn't ask what they meant. He didn't need to. She was protecting the space, warding off whatever bad spirits she believed might come. The strange thing was, he didn't find it foolish. Out there, where the wind had a voice and the land remembered blood, it made sense to trust the unseen. She brought a sacredness to the place. His barn, once filled only with dust and sweat, now held something almost holy. That evening, she spoke more. Told him her father had died, defending their land. That her mother had passed from fever. That she'd been running, not from war, but from being sold off like cattle to a man twice her age. Elias listened, not like a man waiting to speak, but like a canyon listening to the wind carve its story into stone. She didn't cry, didn't beg for pity. She simply told him, and in doing so, gave him more than any kiss ever could. She gave him her truth. In return, Elias told her about the time he watched a boy die in his arms because a doctor was too far and bullets too near. Told her about his brother, lost in the mountains when a storm turned summer to ice in a single night. He didn't say it to impress her. He said it because something about her presence stripped the weight from his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the kind of connection that made a man wonder if fate was more than a word preachers tossed around between whiskey breaths. Days passed. The rhythm of life returned, but everything felt changed. Elias no longer rode just for cattle. He hunted with purpose, cooked with care, built with intention. And Nita? She transformed the place with little things. A woven mat here, a carved symbol there, a song she'd hum at sunrise. The barn had become a home, not by law, not by ceremony, but by the way the silence between them had turned soft. And for the first time since Elias had buried his brother, he found himself hoping the past wouldn't always be heavier than the future. But peace in the West was always a fragile thing, like thin ice under a rider's boots. On the fifth morning, Elias spotted a group of townsmen gathered near the chapel, their voices low but sharp. Among them stood Reverend Holbrook, a man more concerned with order than grace, and Tom Kilmer, a rancher whose pride was as wide as his land. Elias knew that look in their eyes. Men who needed control, who feared what they couldn't name. To them, Nita wasn't just a girl. She was a challenge to everything they believed made the frontier theirs. That afternoon, Elias returned to find a cross burned into the ground outside his barn. The message was clear. You don't belong with her. He stood over the mark for a long time, fists clenched, heart pounding not with fear, but with something more ancient, resolve. He didn't speak of it to Nita. He didn't want her to see the hate they carried. Instead, he doubled down, tightened the fences, reinforced the doors, and carved a new symbol above the threshold, an eagle feather and a horseshoe, side by side, a blend of her people and his, a silent oath. Later that evening, Nita stood at the riverbed, her bare feet in the water, her eyes cast to the stars. She whispered something he couldn't hear, then turned to him and said, "The wind carries many voices. Some are old, some are scared. But truth has no echo, it just stays." Elias didn't ask what she meant. He just walked into the river beside her. In that cold silence, with only the current brushing their ankles, they both understood something that couldn't be spoken. They were no longer just man and woman. They were bound by something deeper, shared defiance. That night, he placed his rifle by the door and sat up while she slept. He wasn't afraid for himself. He feared what men were capable of when they wrapped their fear in righteousness. In the silence, the fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Nita's breathing was steady, peaceful. He watched her sleep and realized that the barn, once a place of work and sweat, had become a sanctuary. It had transformed not through wealth or bricks, but through presence. Through something the town couldn't understand, grace rooted in courage. By morning, Elias rode into town not with anger, but with calm defiance. He tipped his hat at those who turned away and walked straight into the general store. He bought sugar, tobacco, and cloth for a new shawl. As he turned to leave, Reverend Hallbrook met his eyes and said coldly, "You know she's not your kind." Elias paused, then said softly, "Kindness don't need a kind." And with that, he stepped into the street, shoulders straight, heart steady. He didn't need to fight with fists. His presence, calm, unwavering, was the loudest rebellion of all. That same evening, the tribal elder returned. His name was Nahazin, a man whose eyes carried the weight of mountains and whose words flowed like rivers, quiet but unstoppable. He sat across from Elias, placing a small carved totem on the table. "You opened a door," he said. "Now you must walk through it." Elias didn't speak. He just listened, as he always did when wisdom entered the room. The elder spoke of union, not of flesh, but of purpose. To shelter is to claim. To claim is to protect. Are you ready to protect not just her, but what she carries? Elias nodded slowly. He understood. This wasn't just about love or shelter or scandal. This was about lineage, about respect, about honoring something bigger than himself. Nahazin smiled, not with joy, but with recognition, as if he'd seen this story play out in the wind many times before. Before he left, he said one last thing. The land watches, and it remembers who honors it. Then he mounted his horse and vanished into the dusk, leaving behind a silence that seemed to hum with responsibility. In the following days, Nita began teaching Elias pieces of her world. She showed him how to read the soil, how to follow tracks without sound, how to listen to birds not as noise, but as warnings. In turn, Elias showed her how to mend saddle leather, how to shoot straight, and how to read a storm by scent alone. They weren't just sharing space. They were exchanging bloodless rituals, stitching together a life neither of them had expected. Their bond wasn't loud. It was the kind that settled deep, like roots you don't see until a tree weathers a storm. But that storm was coming. Late one afternoon, a rider arrived in town, a U.S. Marshal, lean and pale, with a telegram in hand and a government badge on his chest. He brought orders from the capital. Remove all native presence from ranchlands. The old law had returned, sharp as a new blade. It wasn't personal. It was policy. Elias watched from afar, knowing that in the eyes of the law, Nita wasn't his wife. She wasn't even a person. She was an obstacle. And that meant the next decision would demand more than just courage. It would demand sacrifice. That night, Elias and Nita sat outside by the fire. The stars above seemed closer than usual, and the wind whispered through the grass like a warning. Nita reached for his hand, her fingers rough but warm. "They won't stop," she said. Elias stared into the flames, his jaw set. "Then I won't either. No vows, no speeches, just that one shared understanding. Tomorrow might come with soldiers or threats or exile. But tonight, under that sky, they were exactly what the land had always meant them to be. United, unshakable, and sacred in the face of anyone who dared call them wrong." The sun rose heavy the next morning, casting long, uneasy shadows across the valley. Elias saddled his horse with quiet precision, checking every strap twice. He wasn't planning to run, but he knew what kind of men came with papers and rifles. The kind who smiled as they cleared land, as if land could be cleared of spirit. Nita stood beside him, wrapped in her mother's shawl, silent but fierce. There was no fear in her, only readiness. The barn door creaked behind them as the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dry dust and coming change. They rode together to the ridge overlooking the town. From there, they saw the marshal's wagon parked outside the sheriff's office, soldiers resting in the shade, their boots caked in travel. Elias knew a few of them by name, men who had once shared stew with him under the stars. Now, they followed orders written by hands that had never touched this soil. Nita said nothing, but Elias could feel the way her fingers tightened around the reins. The land below no longer felt like home. It felt like a claim being redrawn by men who didn't understand what they were erasing. Back at the homestead, Elias pulled out an old box buried beneath floorboards. Inside were letters from his father, a Confederate saber rusted by time, and a tin badge he'd once worn when law came from guts, not ink. He placed the badge in Nita's hands. "This once meant I stood for something," he said. "Now I stand for you." She looked down at the medal, then back at him, her eyes unreadable. Then, slowly she nodded, not in approval, but in trust, like one warrior honoring another before battle. Word spread quickly. Elias was refusing to comply. The saloon buzzed with talk. Some called him foolish, others brave. A few said he'd finally gone mad from all those years alone with cattle and whiskey. But the truth was simpler. Elias had finally found something worth defending with more than bullets. The land, the barn, the silence. They were all reflections of a life carved out through hardship. But Nita had brought him a reason. Not just to live, but to matter. To be more than a shadow, riding toward dusk. When the marshal finally arrived, his voice was calm, rehearsed, and distant. "You're harboring someone under federal removal order," he said. Elias stood firm. "I'm standing beside my wife." The word echoed through the valley like a shot. The soldiers tensed, but the marshal held up a hand. "You'll lose everything," he warned. Elias didn't blink. "Everything I needed found me in a thunderstorm and asked for shelter. I'll lose nothing that matters." Behind him, Nita stepped forward. Not hiding, not shrinking, just standing, with him, for him, and as him. Tension hung in the air like the stillness before a gunfight. The marshal stared at Elias, trying to measure the man behind the dirt and denim. He hadn't expected resistance. Most men folded the moment paper touched their front door. But Elias wasn't most men. He wasn't fighting out of rebellion. He was standing out of reverence. The silence stretched until one of the soldiers, younger than the rest, shifted nervously and asked, "Sir, what do we do if he don't move?" The marshal didn't answer, because deep down, he knew moving Elias would require more than men. It would require blood. The tribe arrived that evening, not in anger, but in unity. Riders appeared along the ridgeline, like shadows cut from the horizon. Women, elders, and children followed slowly, carrying baskets, herbs, and firewood. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply came and surrounded Elias's land with presence. A quiet, formidable shield. For the first time in years, the people of the valley witnessed something rarely seen. A community that didn't need permission to be sacred. The land recognized its own, and in doing so, rejected the hands that sought to divide it. Nita's grandmother, a woman whose face looked carved from desert stone, stood beside Elias and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You chose not to run," she said in a whisper that somehow cut through the wind. "So now the land will stand with you." That night, they lit fires all around the homestead. Not as a warning, but as a ceremony. Songs rose into the sky, songs in a language older than any map. Elias didn't understand the words, but he felt them in his bones. The rhythm, the cadence, it was the sound of belonging. Down in the town, fear turned into confusion. The sheriff met with the marshal behind closed doors. "You want to spill blood over this?" the sheriff asked. The marshal shook his head, unsure. It was one thing to enforce policy. It was another to dismantle a stand made with silence and song. The law was heavy, yes, but so was the weight of a town witnessing honor. One by one, townsfolk began drifting toward the edge of Elias's land, not with torches, but with questions. Watching, listening, wondering if maybe they'd forgotten something vital in all their rules and fences. By morning, the marshal gave his answer, not with words, but by riding away. No paper served, no rifles drawn, just the creak of a wagon wheel and the whisper of surrender disguised as silence. Elias watched him vanish into the distance, then turned to Nita. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She simply nodded once, the way the earth might nod after holding steady through a storm. They hadn't won land. They hadn't won approval. They had won something far more rare in the West, respect. And that, as any cowboy knew, was a currency no law could tax. The dust hadn't yet settled when the first visitor arrived. A boy, no older than 13, son of a rancher who once spit at Elias's boots. He brought with him a bundle of firewood and an apology written on his face. He didn't speak, just dropped the logs by the barn and looked up at Elias like he was trying to understand something new. Elias placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded. That gesture, small and wordless, spread through the town faster than any sermon. For the first time, children started asking their parents what honor really meant. Nita, meanwhile, tended to the land with the same quiet devotion she had always carried. She planted herbs in the corners of the barn, stitched new blankets for buffalo hide, and painted small symbols along the walls, symbols of balance, of courage, of the sun and the bone. Elias didn't always know their meanings, but he could feel them. Every corner of his homestead began to breathe differently, not with fear or haste, but with intention. A place once built for survival had become a place for memory and meaning. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in fire, the elder Nahazin returned with a gift, a drum made from elk hide, painted with a single black feather. "This is your echo," he said to Elias. "When you are gone, let this speak for you." Elias ran his hand along its surface, feeling every groove and knot. He didn't say thank you, because in the language of the West, gratitude wasn't spoken. It was lived. That night, the drum echoed across the land as Nita danced alone under the stars, her movements graceful and firm, like a flame that refused to bow to wind. Then came a knock, a strange sound in a place where visitors didn't knock. It was Ruth Harmon, the preacher's widow. Her hands trembled as she stood at their door, clutching a jar of honey and a look of shame. "I was wrong," she whispered, barely louder than the breeze. "You gave her safety. You gave her what the rest of us didn't." Nita took the jar gently, and instead of closing the door, invited Ruth inside. That night, 3 women sat together near the fire, saying little, sharing everything. The West, it seemed, was finally beginning to listen. But in the distance, something darker stirred. A letter arrived from the capital. A second warning, this time more official. The land had drawn attention. "Suspicious integration," it read. "Further inspection pending." Elias read it twice, then burned it. The flames devoured the paper fast, but not the meaning behind it. The battle wasn't over. The winds of bureaucracy would return, wearing new names and new uniforms. But Elias wasn't afraid. He had the land. He had the tribe. And most of all, he had Nita. What he didn't have was the luxury of pretending the storm was gone, only that he'd face it standing. The storm came not with soldiers, but with settlers, men bearing deeds signed by strangers in distant cities. They claimed ownership of parcels Elias had ridden across since he was 17. Maps in hand, they pointed and talked of boundaries, of fences, of rights granted by coin and ink. One even laughed when he saw the woven symbols Nita had painted near the gate. "Pretty decoration," he said. Elias didn't speak. He simply stood between the man and the barn, hands relaxed but firm. This time, he wouldn't fight with steel or fire. He'd fight with presence. Nita knew the rhythm of this conflict. It wasn't new to her people. They had lived it for centuries. Land turned into lines, lives turned into property. But she also knew patience. As the men argued and staked, she and the tribe moved quietly, planting crops, gathering herbs, creating a rhythm of life that didn't require permission. While others debated who owned the earth, Nita became one with it. And slowly, the land responded. Stronger harvests, calmer animals, cleaner streams. The valley began to remember itself through her hands. Elias met with the town council, requested no favors. He spoke plainly. "You can own what's on paper, but you can't own what breathes." Some scoffed. Others listened. A few quietly agreed. Because the truth was becoming harder to ignore, while others argued over land, Elias and Nita had built something. Not just a home, not just a family, but a legacy of union, born from storm and silence. It was a legacy the wind carried, and the birds echoed in their dawn calls. A story the soil was already writing in root and stone. The settlers returned days later, this time with threats. One kicked over a fire pit, another slashed the barn door with a knife. Elias didn't raise a hand. But that night, the tribe surrounded the land again, not with weapons, but with drums, fires, chants. The settlers couldn't sleep, couldn't think, and by morning, they were gone. Not chased, not fought, simply erased by a presence too strong to be denied. A presence that didn't yell, it endured. And in the West, endurance was the highest form of defiance. Nita later carved a new mark into the barn's beam, a symbol that meant they tried. We stayed. Elias ran his fingers over it, feeling pride rise in his chest like thunder rolling across the plains. The barn still bore scars. The gate still leaned, but their story had held, not because it was written in law, but because it was lived in truth. And for the first time in decades, Elias looked out across the horizon and didn't see land to fight for. He saw land that now knew his name. As the season shifted, so did the air around Dead Man's Creek. What had once been a land ruled by suspicion and fear began to grow quieter, more reflective. Children from the town wandered toward Elias's land with questions, not stones. They asked Nita about the feathers she wore in her braid, about the songs she sang that echoed like water through canyon walls. She answered each one with care, never forcing, never preaching, just sharing. Elias watched as the same people who once avoided his eyes now brought their sons and daughters to sit in Nita's shade, hungry not for food, but for meaning. One afternoon, a young couple approached. The man had once mocked Elias during a poker game. The woman had avoided Nita in the market. But now, hands joined, they asked if she would bless the land where they hoped to build their home. It wasn't religion they wanted, it was rootedness, something deeper than doctrine. Nita didn't smile, but her eyes softened. She agreed, leading them to a spot under a mesquite tree and speaking words in her mother's tongue, planting a bundle of sage beneath the soil. It was a small thing, but the moment lingered like perfume in the wind. Elias began to carve again, something he hadn't done since his brother's death. He took old wood from the broken corral and began shaping it into animals, hawks, wolves, and deer. He placed them along the fence posts, as if inviting the old spirits back. Nita laughed the first time she saw them. "You build a forest," she teased. "I build a story," he answered. And in that exchange, they both understood. The West was no longer just a place of struggle. It could also be a place of healing, if the hands that shaped it remembered the stories that came before. But not everyone embraced change. There were still whispers, still watchful eyes. A banker from the north arrived, offering to buy Elias's land at triple its value. He claimed a railway was coming, that the valley would soon be flooded with progress. Elias listened, then asked the man if progress ever remembered names. The banker didn't understand. He offered a signature. Elias offered a story. "This land," he said, "holds the echo of her footsteps and the weight of my silence. That's worth more than your steel." The man left angry, but Elias didn't care. Some things weren't for sale. That night, the two sat by the fire, watching sparks rise like stars returning to the sky. Nita leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "The world always comes back around. It forgets, then it remembers. We just have to keep reminding it." Elias didn't reply. He simply reached for her hand, rough and steady, and held it. Because in that quiet, in that flicker of flame and shadow, he understood something most men spent a lifetime chasing. Peace wasn't the absence of war. It was the presence of truth. And they had built it, together, from nothing but kindness and dust. Years passed like wind through wheat, gentle, relentless, unforgettable. The barn aged with grace, its beams darkened by sun, its roof patched by careful hands. Children now ran through its doors laughing, weaving between bales of hay and old saddles. Some had skin like Elias, others like Nita. All of them knew the same stories, of storms, of choices, of the night a stranger found shelter, and the morning two worlds became one. The land held those tales like a grandfather holds the voice of his youth, quietly, with pride and pain alike. Elias no longer rode far. His back had stiffened, his hands curled with time, but his eyes still saw everything. He sat most mornings under the porch, watching Nita teach the children how to read the sky and track the wind. She had become something between a legend and a heartbeat in the valley, a woman both feared and revered. Strangers still came, looking for truth in the shape of her words. And every time they left with more questions than answers, they left lighter, as if some old burden had been peeled from their soul. One winter evening, the tribe gathered for a dance, the largest in years. Drums echoed through the canyon. Firelight danced off painted faces, and voices sang of origin, of loss, of love. Elias was given a seat near the center, wrapped in a blanket woven with his and Nita's names. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than any sermon. The land that had once been silent now sang back through the feet of children and the rhythm of survival reborn as joy. A man from the government arrived not long after, expecting resistance and policy debates. Instead, he was met with food, fire, and a history too thick to uproot. He tried to explain zoning. Nita handed him a necklace of turquoise and bone. "Here," she said, "wear this while you speak. Then maybe the land will listen to you too." He paused, confused, then, slowly, sat beside the fire and stopped talking. That night, he didn't return to the town. He stayed to listen. Sometimes the greatest change begins with silence. And in the end, when the wind blew colder and the stars began to feel closer, Elias knew his story had found its place. Not in books, not in courtrooms, but in soil and fire and memory. The cowboy who once rode alone now walked beside generations, shaped by his one small choice, to open a barn door to a stranger. And in that choice, the West had found a new kind of legend, not written in blood or gold, but in love that refused to be erased. In the vast and untamed silence of the Old West, stories were rarely written with ink. They were carved into the land by choices, by sacrifice, and by the quiet courage to stand when it would have been easier to turn away. Elias never intended to become a symbol. He was just a man trying to live with dignity. And yet, his simple act of sheltering a stranger in the middle of a storm became the spark that transformed an entire valley. Not through force, not through fame, but through the stubborn power of doing what was right when no one else dared. The bond between Elias and Nita was not one of convenience or romance built for song. It was forged in silence, in pain, in honor. She brought him roots where he once drifted like dust. He gave her space to be more than what the world feared. Together, they created something rare in a place obsessed with power and property, belonging. Their legacy wasn't sealed by bloodshed or conquest, but by the laughter of children running through fields that once echoed with threats. It was a quiet revolution, the kind only the earth remembers. And maybe that's what the West has always needed. Not louder guns or higher fences, but men and women brave enough to listen to each other across the lines. To see a soul before they see a label. To offer protection without demanding payment. What Elias and Nita taught wasn't about marriage or tribe, but about humanity. That when we open our doors, even for one night, we might be unlocking generations of healing. That love, when chosen in truth, can outlive bullets, borders, and even time. So when you hear stories of the West, of cowboys, of conquest, of land, remember this one. The tale of a man who didn't raise a gun, but a home. Of a woman who didn't run from judgment, but stood taller than it. Let it remind you that sometimes the greatest rebellions begin not with fire, but with kindness. And that maybe, just maybe, the barns we build for others are the temples that shelter ourselves. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your chest, or brought a tear you weren't expecting, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to keep exploring the hidden corners of history that still whisper truth. Like the video if you believe that small actions can change the world, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done that night if someone knocked on your door during a storm?